Want to talk a little bit about evaluating feeder calves coming in, because I guess you'll have several situations. Some people might be their own calves, okay, and if it's your own calves, your own breeding program and everything, that's one thing. But if you're going to try and buy calves from the stockyard to put into a feeding program, there are several things to consider. And these are the things that the order buyers and all are considering when they're buying cattle to send them out west. So some of them, want to just go through some of the factors that's going to affect what price you can expect to pay or whatever. Of course, health is one of them. Dr. Arnold talked about health. And so sick calves at the stockyard, do they ever show up? Sure. What happens typically? Discount, big time discount. Now, is that why? I mean, is that a good thing, bad thing? You know, of course we're going to expect to see a discount, but are those calves, they're not valueless, are they? As a matter of fact, there's some people that kind of make a living off of taking those calves that are sick, straightening them out, and then putting them back into the system as a healthy calf. And there's some value to doing that. What are some things that person is going to deal with? They're going to have high treatment costs, right? So they're going to have more inputs into it. And they're likely to have higher death loss. And so they're going to have to deal with the losses of that potential income as well. But if they can overcome that and have greater return based on the value that they put into it, then of course it is a value. And like I say, there are people that do that, and it is a potential way to make some money. All right, let's talk about color / breed. First, let's talk about color. Why is color an issue when we start talking about pricing? It is, right? Everybody agrees that color is certainly going to have an impact on pricing of feeder calves. Why?
Marketing. The Angus is marketed the black.
Okay.
Well, from a purchaser standpoint, that's the best way to kind of tell what quality potentially you might have. You're just associating color with, back to marketing.
Yeah. So we can all agree here today that color doesn't impact any economically relevant trait or a production trait, right? Marbling, gain, feed efficiency, color doesn't impact any of that. So what is color being used at? It's an indicator of breed, potentially, right? Or at least some indication. And so I think everybody knows that the black cattle are typically the ones that are favored at the market, with the perception that those are somehow Angus-based cattle, right? I mean, that's what it's going back to. So why is that important? What is it about Angus that makes it important? I mean, why do you want that association once again back with Angus?
Value, saleability.
It's the marketing program started with CAB, right? Certified Angus Beef, and so it goes back to that marketing program that was extremely successful. Now, I'll ask you guys, how much Angus does it take for CAB?
0.
None, right? Takes 51% black hiding, not 51% Angus. Okay? So a straight bred limousine can be certified Angus beef. All right? So there's a little bit of a misconception there. And so when certified Angus beef became so popular, and it wasn't based on really a breed thing, it was a color thing, instead of all the other breeds kind of coming out with a competitive program, what did they do? They imitated Angus, right? So they just turned them black to get in on the same successful program. There's 2 breeds that had a little bit more difficult time with that, right? Charolais, because theirs isn't a color gene, it's what we call diluter genes that cause Charolais to be the white color. And Hereford, at least up until recently, primarily due to the stubbornness, I guess, of the association, because they have a closed record book. Now, I'm not saying stubbornness from a bad standpoint. but they have a closed record book and they weren't willing to open that up their herd book, okay? Which means that there's no way of getting the black gene in there because it's not naturally in the breed. Now, some innovative people have broken away from the American Hereford Association and have their own associations, and they're going through a grading up program to where they do have black Herefords now. Rob, Charolais just out of luck in that regard.
Just can't figure it out.
It's a much more difficult deal dealing with those diluter genes. All right, so but it does make a factor. And coming back to the Charolais cross calves, that tends to be a good bit regional, I think, in terms of the price discrimination or lack thereof for the Charolais cattle. You can go to, when we do the polling or the bull selection program through the Master Cattleman program, you go to some counties, they won't buy a Charolais. No way, no how. They said they get discounted at the market. And you go to other counties and they're just as popular as the Angus bulls. And so there are some differences in the marketing on which markets will accept those smoky colored calves. Now when you get to the breed aspect of it, when we look at the cute little thing at the bottom, that's where breed really does come into play, right? When you start talking about the dairy breeds versus the beef breeds, now we have some differences that are truly due to some performance issues, okay? So dairy cattle, what is it about dairy cattle that makes them less desirable from a price standpoint? Why are they not willing to pay as much for a dairy cattle?
Muscle?
Muscle, okay. So is there anything wrong with the meat?
No.
As a matter of fact, dairy cattle tend to marble quite well. I mean, the quality of the meat for dairy cattle is really good. And actually, a lot of what we eat is dairy meat, to be quite honest. I mean, so you consume quite a bit of it, and there's nothing wrong with it. It comes to a matter primarily of muscle, the fact that we don't have as much muscle, so the muscle shape in terms of trying to sell at the grocery store and all is not as desirable. It's a much more narrow muscle that we see in the dairy type cattle. But another big one is just efficiency in the feedlot. They are not as efficient. And the reason that they're not is they have much higher maintenance costs, okay? Because they have bigger internal organs, your livers, your guts, and everything else that have a high demand on the energy requirement, and that doesn't get transferred into gain, okay? So they use a lot more energy just to go to maintenance, which makes them less efficient typically in the feedlot, okay? So, you can have some health issues too, just in terms of how the dairy breeds are managed early in life, and the fact that they're not crossbred. I mean, very few dairy cattle are crossbred, so you don't get that added benefit of better immunity and all through the crossbreeding program. Okay? Any questions about color or breed? All right, so another aspect is whether or not they have horns or scurs or if they're polled. Cattle with horns can be a problem, right? They can injure other cattle, people, hard to get through the equipment and chutes and everything. So horns, typically, if they have them, they have to be dehorned. When we dehorn, it sets the calves back a bit. And so that's why there's a price discount for horn cattle. Scurs are a horn-like substance, but they are not attached to the skull. Horns are attached to the skull, scurs are not. And so you can wiggle them, they're loose. Really not as big of an issue, but typically most people go ahead and take those off as well. From a perception, it cleans them up and everything. And so typically you'll see some discount for the scurs, particularly if there are any size scurs at all as well. Now we can take care of some of that through our breeding programs and all, but once they're there, that they tend to cause some discount. I didn't put it on here, but sex is the other issue that's a price factor, right? So we have 3 sex categories, right? Bulls, steers, heifers. So what is the pricing? What's the most valuable of the 3? Steers, typically, right? What's next? Bulls, and usually really, really close behind, right? And we talked about it in the earlier group. We really don't see probably the level of discount for bulls that we probably should see. I think that a lot of these people that are bringing in calves are just used to dealing with it and going ahead and castrating them. But we don't see a whole lot of a discount for the bull calves, and then there's a substantial discount back down to the heifers. Now, why? Why are heifers discounted? It's the efficiency in general, but yeah, slower growing and not quite as good a conversion as well. So they typically don't, so they bring a little bit of a discount. But so what's the difference between bulls and steers? Now, can we feed out bulls? Sure. What do you get? You get a leaner product. They grow really fast. They grow really good, and that's why a lot of people don't bother with castrating them, because they're going to grow good. Typically, if we do castrate, that's what we use implants for in a lot of cases, is to replace and get that added growth back again from implants that we take away by actually castrating. Okay, and so they grow good. If you take them to older ages, bulls do not eat as good. They can be a little bit tougher. Like I said, they're definitely leaner, don't marble as well. But then, you can get into some actual meat quality issues if you take them up to very old at all. Okay? All right. So the other aspect is the grade, the actual feeder calf grade, which is dependent on their frame and muscle. So from a frame standpoint, it's real simple. It breaks into just 3 categories: large frame, medium frame, and small frame. And what we're trying to do with this is project how big they're going to be at the optimum finish point, which is about a ½ an inch of fat over the ribeye. You can see for the large frame, for the steers, it's going to be over 1250. The heifer's over 1150. So for medium frame, 11 to 1250, and 1000 to 1150 for the heifers. And then the small, under 1100, under 1000. So where do most cattle fall within? Yeah, large, most of them, with a good many in that medium as well. But a good percentage of the cattle are going to fall into that large frame category. Some are going to dip down. We don't have a whole lot of small frame cattle. So from a desirability standpoint, what's the most desirable? Large. I'm going to say I'm the geneticist, right? So the answer any geneticist is going to give you is it depends. That's our best answer. Think about it, because if you're grass feeding or wanting to turn cattle over quickly in the feed yard, smaller frame cattle are going to do that better, okay, typically. So larger frame, what we're tending to get, we are going to get a little bit better growth typically, a little bit faster growth, but we're going to have to take them to heavier weights, and we're going to have to feed them a little longer to get them to that optimum endpoint, all right? So that's kind of what we're looking at on differences there. How that impacts us, this is the growth curve. And what I just pointed out, it's not a perfect growth curve, but it's close enough. What we tend to have cattle, after birth, they start growing at a pretty slow rate of gain. At some point in time, they start gaining at a more rapid growth rate. And then at some point in life, if we kept on feeding them, they would slow down again in terms of their average daily gain. Okay, so think of that as average daily gain. Low average daily gain, really high average daily gain, low average daily gain. So the part that's easy to understand, I think, is this part. Out here is a little more difficult to understand, because out here, they're older, they're heavier, they're gaining less. Are they eating less? No. Eating more, gaining less. Great diet, right? Eat more, gain less. All right. The point is they are still gaining, so don't use that as your diet. All right, so why? How can they eat more and gain less?
Maintenance.
Rob, maintenance is going to be some of it, but it's more of a wash. It really is. Maintenance can contribute some of that, but not to that level by a far stretch.
Maturity.
Well, maturity is the right answer, but what physiologically is causing that?
Fat instead of muscle?
That's right. Here, look down here. Here we're putting on muscle, okay? Here we're starting to put on a lot more fat compared to muscle. So think of it from the standpoint of caloric density, okay? A pound of fat versus a pound of muscle. Which one has more calories in it? Pound of fat has more calories than a pound of muscle, okay? If it has more in it, it took more to put in it, right? So they took more feed to make that pound of fat. So fat is less efficient. It takes more pounds of feed to put on a pound of fat than it does to put on a pound of muscle. And so that's why out here, when they're primarily putting on fat, we see that inefficiency, okay? People talk about bone all the time. Bone is pretty consistent. There's very little difference between cattle in terms of the amount of bone that they have. It's not a big player there. All right, so thickness is the other part of the feeder calf grade, frame and thickness. Thickness, there are 4 categories or 4 thickness scores. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4, decreasing in the level of muscling that they have, being number 1 being the heaviest muscle. Number 1 and number 2 are predominantly beef type cattle. Good, you can see good conformation to them. You see a good bit of muscling in those cattle. And as well as muscling, they have good condition as well. Okay, so that they have some level of fat that they're depositing. So they have the good muscling, but also reasonable amount of condition as well. The 3s and 4s are where we're starting to get less muscle and less condition. So there's 2 reasons I think that cattle can have this lack of muscling. All right, one of them is what? Genetically a lack of muscling, which typically comes with some dairy breeding, right? What's another reason that you would see very little muscling through the hind quarter? If they're in poor condition, right? If they haven't been fed right, they don't have much body fat at all, because muscle is also an energy reserve. We don't think of it that way. We think of just fat as an energy reserve, but muscle is an energy reserve too. So if they get to the point where they're in negative energy balance and have used up all the fat, what do they start using? Muscle, right? All right, so we can see it that way as well. But typically, you're going to see some dairy breeding in there as well. But remember, all of these categories are healthy cattle. It's not sick cattle. There's a different grade, inferior. It's the grade for sick cattle or cattle that don't fit into the normal mode, okay? And so those are the grades, the feeder calf grades that we typically deal with.